I firmly believe it's not selfish to work on yourself. I think it is of self-interest, but I think it's one of the most important things you can do, not only to show up with your, highest potential to what you can do in a day and all those tasks that we have and responsibilities, but also so that we can best serve the people that we love.
Fellas, what's going on? I hope this episode finds you well, and I hope this episode leaves you better than when it found you. Today's episode is with Jake Kennington, and he is an engineer. He is a children's book author, and he's a coach and just a good, solid guy who has some great insights for guys who are trying to put it all together. He's a father, he's a husband, a business owner, and someone who, similar to, I'm sure, a lot of you guys out there, is navigating life and trying to do it while being a great guy and a great father, all those roles, right? To really play his roles well. And that's what I think that this episode is really about, is like how to be a great man. And so enough of me, y'all. Let's get into today's episode with Jake Kennington. Jake, welcome to the Modern Masculinity Podcast. It's great to have you here.
Hey, Hector, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be on the show and chat for a bit.
I always ask our guests to take us into their world and share a little bit of the muck that they're working through today as a man. I shared before we hopped on that, I've got a sick kid who is, before we were recording this, she fell asleep on the couch. The little guy was hacking away over the weekend. And so it's been an interesting sort of journey. What sort of challenges or obstacles do you find yourself still navigating as a man today?
Yeah, I loved hearing about your kids. I also have kids of my own. I've been married for 15 years and we've got 4 little ones, so ages 2 to 11. We've got 2 older boys that are 8 and 11 years old, and then 2 little girls that are 2 and 4. And so, as you can imagine, and all your listeners can imagine, if you've got kids at home, we're just busy. And there's sick things going on. We just got over some sicknesses. There was the holidays, there's sports. My oldest son just did a science fair project, which was, all these things are super fun, but they're just time consuming and trying to show up to be a dad. So although it's great and I love doing it, it's a lot of work and a lot of burden on my shoulders sometimes. So that's probably the biggest muck that I'm going through, is just the excitement of being a father and a dad and a husband as good as I can. I also work a full-time job as a structural engineer. And then I own a business as well. And so trying to balance those 2 things or those 3 things, right? Family and 2 jobs can be quite difficult at times, but life is good. I can't complain, and we're all happy here and healthy. So,
yeah, I remind myself of that often, that aside from this cold, prior to this, we were running on a few months of perfect attendance. And it was like my son brought his December perfect attendance home on Monday, and then he missed school on Tuesday, or vice versa, one of the 2. But I'm impressed and grateful that it took this long for the school year for them to sort of get sick. But it can be a lot. And I think that is sort of the theme of this podcast, is that doing one of those things that you mentioned is its own challenge. Being a great dad, being a great husband or partner, having a business, having a job, trying to keep your own sanity, all of those on their own are their own worthy foe. And it seems like men are not the expectations, but I think we have aspirations of putting it all together for ourselves, which I don't think there's been too many models of that before, or things that, people that we can look to say like, oh, they had it all figured out. Because it seems like the people who we thought had it all figured out maybe didn't actually.
Yeah, totally. There's a lot of balls to juggle, a lot of things to do. And I don't want to come off too negative there. I try to view all those things as challenges and great things that I have in my life. I wouldn't ask for anything different, right? I'm at a good spot and I enjoy my business and my career as an engineer. I love my kids and my wife. And so although there are things to be dealt with, they're exciting and the future's bright. So
yeah, I think one of the things that we've talked about is going up the ladders of manhood. And it seems that, big life events tend to be the catalyst for those things, whether it's having a kid or starting a business or getting married or whatever it may be. And that this is what we asked for. This is what we wanted. And I think that so many times we end up getting exactly what we wanted. And in that moment, can we choose to be grateful or to sort of damn it, and I'm like you and try and remember that. But I think it can be a challenge sometimes when you're in the middle of it to remind yourself like, no, these are the good old days. I just don't know it yet.
Yeah, totally. You reminded me of an experience I had with my own family and my kids about over 11 years ago now, because my son's 11. I wrote a children's book, and I wrote it for my unborn son. My wife was pregnant at the time, and I wanted to pass on some of life lessons, things that I'd learned from my own experience that I could teach him and like distill it into this book. So I wrote it for him, self-published it. It was just kind of a passion project, a family project for a while. We kept it within the family. We never put it up on Amazon or anything like that. And eventually we did, like 10 years later. So I think it was almost 2 years ago now, we self-published it on Amazon. But the premise of the story was it was about this ladder or different experience in life of becoming a man step by step. And the story was about us having our first child and how our life was going to be turned upside down completely. We knew that from the outside looking in, but we'd never gone through that experience. And again, I wrote that book about that, going from just the two of us to having a kid, but it was written from the perspective of our dog. And so his life was great with us, right? Just the three of us. And then all of a sudden there's this kid that kind of took over all our time and attention, and he got kind of kicked to the curb. And long story short is he gained another friend, a fourth member of the family, and somebody that loves him dearly. And so, yeah, I think we know what we're signing up for to an extent before we get to that next ladder or that next step. But a lot of it's unknown, right? It's a little scary, and you don't really know what you're signing up for until you get there. And that could be fatherhood. That could be getting married. That could be starting a business. That could be your career. Like I signed up to be an engineer when I was in college. I had no idea what that meant in reality, right? What responsibilities I was going to have and how that was all going to pan out. And so we have to have a little bit of faith when we make those decisions and just trust that we're headed in the right direction and course correct as we go.
Yeah. One of the things that I'm wrestling with sort of as a dad and a father, and most of the listeners know this, but to catch you up, I'm what I call like a solo dad, because I'm not like technically a single dad. They still see their mom occasionally, but most of the time it's all on me. And that is a unique opportunity, and also like the biggest challenge of my life. Because again, it's again, if I just had to be a stay-at-home dad, cool. Like that's one thing. I think like that there's a funny meme on X going around where like guys are saying like the stay-at-home part is actually the easiest part. Like they're like, we get to do this. We don't know what everyone's been complaining about. This is the easy. And the difference is that when you have to do both, right? When you have to be the caretaker and the provider at the same time, like that's just an interesting challenge. And don't get me wrong, stay-at-home moms, they have their own unique challenges and they have their mental load to bear and deal with. And I'm not downplaying any of that. But recently I've realized that like I am growing up with my kids, right? You sort of you hear that sometimes we're like, oh, I was when you have a young parent, it's like I was growing up and I see all these things where I'm sort of forcing myself to have to learn on the fly because of the situations. And there's also so many things that I'm like, not wanting to pass down either, in terms of my mindset or poor habits or whatever it is, right? My like, candy addiction or like all those sorts of things that like, for me growing up, it was one thing if you're just responsible for yourself, but where all of a sudden your choices are making clear impacts on other human beings. I think it's just an interesting responsibility that sort of forces you to wake up and grow up a lot faster.
Yeah, I've had that same experience. My 4-year-old daughter asked me, I think it was yesterday, she goes, Dad, what are you going to do when you grow up? And I just thought it was so funny. I've heard that phraseology before, but it came from her mouth. I don't know where she heard that or why she thought that. But at 4 years old, and I turn 40 next month. And so she goes, Dad, what are you going to do when you grow up? And I really thought about it for a while. I was like, man, it's almost like sky's the limit. There's the things I've done in the past professionally and also within my family and hobbies that I've had. And those are all great. I don't want to burn any of that down or start over per se, but I can build on top of that and do whatever it is that I want to do. So I love that idea that we kind of grow up with our kids. And I think looking back as well at our own parents, for me at least, that gives me a lot of empathy for my own parents, right? Because I'm like, man, as a kid, you just idolize your parents and you put them on a pedestal and you look at them as like they have life figured out. And then you become a parent and you're like, oh, they were just treading water trying to stay afloat. You know, they were trying to figure it out as they went, and they grew up with us, and we're growing up with our kids. And so it's a pattern that repeats itself. But I think we learn a lot from being parents and being fathers. And I'm super grateful for that experience.
Yeah. My son, it's like we're going through this interesting phase because you have that phase where like you're a superhero. And then all of a sudden he beats you at tetherball one time and you're like, and you were like, actually, you weren't like sandbagging totally, but you're like, sure. You actually, he beats you that one time and he like laughed. And I was like, man, okay, well, this is an interesting experience just because internally, like we see all of our flaws. And this is just like, there's that imposter syndrome that people deal with or whatever, like self-worth. Like we know ourselves the most, right? And so we don't oftentimes give ourselves enough credit or the same credit that other people do. And I think that same thing can happen as a parent where our kids, they sort of have this idolized view of us. And I think that's fantastic. And I also, like, I see it sometimes and I'm like, it sort of highlights the deficits, right? It kind of shows me where I'm not fully super, hero and actually flawed, right? And which is sort of scary because it's like, I think just reconciling those two things where, we're fully responsible for these human beings and we are sort of flawed individuals. At least for me, like I go through moments of like worry and doubt, I guess is probably the biggest thing that sort of emerges out of that is like, am I capable of pulling this off? And sort of faith kicks in, but it's sometimes it takes a while.
Yeah, as your kids get older, I've had this experience. It's not a fun one, but talking about, your kids kind of shedding light on what you do as a parent and you're under a microscope a little bit. The worst feeling is when your kid does something that's not great and you realize that it is something that they learned from you. The other day, one of my sons, I forget which one, he was yelling at his sister and did something to her that was kind of rude or mean. And just the way he did it kind of mimicked how I am sometimes. I'm not always that way. I feel like I'm pretty easygoing and pretty joyful and happy and nice to my kids. But, we do model some of those imperfections sometimes and they pick up on those things. And so it made me think, I've got to be better at modeling the kind of person that I want them to become and just be a little more aware of how I show up with my kids so that they can have the best model possible going forward. Me and my wife are going to take like a weekend trip next weekend. We're just going to go, I think it's just one night because we can only get away for one night. And we're going to go without the kids. We don't do this very often. And we're going to go to dinner and, all the fun things, maybe go see a show or something. But we're also going to spend time talking about our kids and our family and what we're doing right. And then maybe some things that we can improve on. And so, yeah, we're all a work in progress, but kids definitely shine a light on those areas that we need more improvement, perhaps.
Well, I think for me, I'm grateful that they sort of provide that because, recently they went up and spent some time with their mom. And I was just, my routine went out the window. I was like sleeping in and slobbing out. And it was okay. I had to give myself some grace because it's like, I don't really get a whole lot of opportunity to just not have any responsibility. And so I sort of took that time to recover. And I also realized how much structure and how honest they keep me, and how in line. And because I want to exemplify or be an example of these certain habits or values or whatever, that when they're not there, I'm like, oh man, like I need to keep myself accountable now, which is a different level of accountability than having someone else, even if it's your kids, looking over your shoulder. I eat much less candy when they are home than when they are not. I don't have to hide it from anybody. Talk to me about your ideas. You sort of work with men in some capacity. Talk to me about the idea of we call it integrated masculinity, which is sort of putting it all together, right? Like how do you put it all together? How do you have it all? How do you be joyful and stronger? How do you be with your emotions and still, have sovereignty? When it comes to that sort of idea, what are your thoughts around how men can better do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me go back just a little bit and I'll share a little bit more about my background. So back in 2010, 11, 12, I was studying civil engineering back in California where I grew up. and leaned that way because I'm a left-brained person. I like the maths and the sciences. And so that seemed like a logical fit for me. And for the last 15 years, it's been great. I graduated college. I got married shortly after that. We had kids shortly after that. Took a job for over a decade in California. And then at some point, I kind of realized that I needed to change things up. A lot of people go through an experience like this and they go, I want more. I don't know if what I'm doing is quite right. I want something different. I want something new, but they don't know what that is. And that was my experience. So my poor wife and my kids, I moved my family, our dog from the children's book, my 4 kids and my wife, 800 miles from California to Utah, and took a job as a structural engineer in Salt Lake City. And that job was everything I wanted. It was more responsibility. I was around a lot more engineers. I came from a small firm of 20 people and went to a firm of about 60 people. So I got to see different perspectives and work on different types of jobs. And I got that different itch scratched. And in doing that, I realized that's not actually what I wanted. I want something completely different. And so I think what happens, particularly with fathers and families and growing a family, is that we change and life changes, and therefore our priorities change. I am forever grateful for my roots in college and engineering and all these other things. I in no way feel like I've been duped or tricked or like I got to the top of this mountain and I was like, this isn't what I thought it was going to be. It's exactly what I thought it was going to be. The problem is I changed and my priorities changed. And so I started asking myself, like, what do I want to do for the next 10, 20, 30 years professionally, but also personally? How do I want to spend my time? How do I want to craft a life that's best for me? And that led me to start a company called Actively Human. And I think this ties into the question that you just asked, Hector, was like, how do we put all this together, all these balls that we're trying to juggle and kind of do it, what I would say, in the long term? I think most strategies are good short term. You come up with anything short term, going to the gym, whatever it is, that's like, I'm going to do this and it's crazy. And I'm just going to juggle 50 balls at the same time and I'm going to make it work. The problem is a lot of times long-term that doesn't work out. And so the way I explain it to clients that I work with, which happen to be probably about 90% men, I don't specifically only work with men, but maybe because I am a man, I don't know, maybe I just attract that. I work with a lot of engineers, technical professionals, people that are established in their careers, and they just happen to be men. And so what I teach them and share with them is, how do we put it all together? How are we in this for the long haul, for the long term? Is I use a framework called REDAC, REDAC, and that stands for Redefine, Realign, and Reconnect. And it's really simple. It's only 3 words. And I did that on purpose because simple is memorable and is implementable, right? So the first one, redefine, is redefine success. And the reason I spend a lot of time with my clients on this is because if I asked you, Hector, and myself and 8 other people, if we asked 10 people, what does success mean? You probably get 10 pretty different answers. It's a weird word that doesn't really have a great definition, and it's very dependent on the person. And the irony is, if you ask those same 10 people, including you and myself, a couple years from now, that definition might change. There's a great philosopher named Heraclitus that lived over 2,000 years ago. And he has a quote that's often quoted and I love. And he said something to the effect that no man steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river and it's not the same man. So the life is the river, right? It's always changing and moving. And then we're the man, right? And so no matter if you step in that same river, you're different as life progresses. And so we constantly have to be asking ourselves, like, what does success mean for me in this phase of life? So I spend a lot of time with my clients going over that and really getting clear on like what success means. And then the second part of the framework is realign. So it's decide how you want to show up in the world and then take action, realign with what matters most. So hopefully that kind of answers your question there with how do you put it all together, is get clear on what you want from life and what your family wants and your kids and your spouse and whoever's important to you, and then go take action on that.
Yeah, the redefine part is important, at least for me, because I think that sometimes it's redefining like the external one. And then I've found that I've had to redefine or readjust my perspectives, my outlook, how I am looking at the situation. And going back to what I was saying before, that oftentimes when I'm sitting, if I'm ever complaining or if we're ever going to that like victim state, that oftentimes I realize that this is what I wanted, or if not wanted, this is what I created. And so like I'm responsible sort of for this. And it gives me a little more agency, as opposed to I have found myself sort of falling into not like bouts of helplessness, but on that spectrum where you're like, man, this is not what I wanted. This is not what I signed up for. Or like, I didn't deserve this, or this isn't fair. Like all those sorts of thoughts that just become less helpful. They take away that sort of agency, and sort of if you're able to redefine the situation, then at least in my experience, it gives you back a little more of that, what I'm calling sovereignty. You know, I've been a control freak, and so I don't like to use the word control, but it gives you that sovereignty back to have a choice or have agency.
Sure, I would use the word autonomy. And so by defining what success means for you, you're actually choosing, right? You're being intentional, at least with the definition. I know it's just words on a page at some point, or words that roll off the tongue. And so those have to be followed by action. So that's the realign part. But yeah, I agree with you. I think most of us, including myself, kind of follow the status quo. We do what our parents did. We go to college because everybody went to college. And I'm a big believer in college and following your parents and doing good things that other people are doing around you. The beef is when you do it simply because everybody else is doing it, right? And so you have to get clear on like, what do I want life to be for me? And so my experience 4, 5, 6 years ago was really frustrating, because I got clear on what I wanted from life, but I wasn't taking action on those things. I wasn't in alignment with my core values and the things that I really valued in life, which is time with my family, potentially building a business and all these other things. And again, no knock on corporate America or being an engineer or anything like that. It's just that my priorities had changed, but I was still living a previous version of my own life. And so when people get clear on what they want from life, then they've got to go take the actions and implement those things. And then the last thing in my framework, which I think caught me personally by surprise, but also catches a lot of my clients by surprise, I talk about how Redefine is kind of like the strategy or the head part of the process. And then the Realign is the actions or the tactics or the hands, like what you do. The Reconnect, which stands for reconnect with the people you care about most, is pretty much a byproduct or the results of what happens when you do the first two. And you reconnect with your family members, your loved ones, neighbors, coworkers, whoever it may be, even yourself in this process, because now you're living in alignment with the person that you want to be. And just to give a quick example, about a year ago, I was struggling with this a little bit, being like, well, how do I show up the way that I want to show up? What's important to me? And am I spending time on that? And I developed a really short morning routine. It wasn't anything too lengthy, but it involved reading, writing, and running. So those 3 things, very simple, not a lot of time in each one of those things, but just something I could do before the kids went to school. And then I'd take my kids to school, and then I'd come home and start, the real work of, my job. And several months went by, and my wife made this comment, unsolicited. I didn't ask for feedback. I didn't say, is this working, or what do you think as far as my morning routine goes? But she walked by one day and she goes, man, when you do that stuff in the morning, when you work on yourself with read, write, and run, you're a much nicer person to be around. So for me, I think oftentimes what I struggle with is taking time to work on myself, whatever that looks like for your listeners or for me or for you, Hector. We tend to feel a little selfish, right? We feel like, oh, well, I don't have time for this. I've got to help my kids and my wife, or I have all these other responsibilities. I firmly believe it's not selfish to work on yourself. I think it is of self-interest, but I think it's one of the most important things you can do, not only to show up with your, highest potential to what you can do in a day and all those tasks that we have and responsibilities, but also so that we can best serve the people that we love. And so I'm a firm believer of having some sort of simple morning routine to slide the important stuff first and let the urgent stuff come later in the day.
Yeah, I forget how how critical that is for my sanity. I was fortunate enough to, one of my earliest mentors or coaches in college, business coaches, was Hal Elrod, and he wrote the book called The Miracle Morning. And
Yeah.
I'm so grateful to have that, because I can feel it. I can feel when I don't do, for me, it's breath work and some, some meditation. If I don't get that, I am much shorter with the kids. The things are tangibly, I always joke, like, I'm short naturally, like I'm 5'6", so that's not what I'm talking about. But my temper is noticeably different. And there is a real tangible difference in my ability to deal with just stress, right? And I guess, like, it's easy, kids are sort of that mirror, and they sort of create that. But I think that whether someone is dealing with kids or with a partner or a business, I mean, the ability to be with your emotions, right? And to have a stronger resilience, I think is so important for guys, that if they're not doing that, like, that's something to take away today and to take a stand on, right? And make some, habits that enact that.
And again, it's an interesting byproduct of working on yourself. You show up better for others, right? Like you said, your temper's shorter, you're just more at ease, more calm, less reactive and more proactive, right? Is how I would phrase that. And so again, I think it's a bit of a surprise for myself, my own journey, but also with my clients, that when they redefine success and take action to realign with what's most important, what they've defined as most important, kind of a byproduct of this process is that they connect on a deeper level with the people that they care about most. And what I've learned in my almost 40 years on this earth is that I've been around. I don't feel like I'm that old yet. I feel like I'm getting there, but I still feel pretty young, but it's not my first rodeo. And I was keeping track of some things that I've been through in my life, where I've been around the world and just professionally. And I wrote a few things down that I find interesting. I've lived in 25 different apartments or homes. I've lived in 14 different cities in my life in 2 different countries. I lived in South America for 2 years as a missionary. And I've had 40 roommates, over 40 roommates. That doesn't include my current family or my 5 siblings growing up or my parents. That's just college roommates and other places in the world that I've lived. And I've had 22 jobs. Some of those were for a summer, some of those were for a decade. And the reason I share all that is because I've been around a lot of different people in a lot of different settings, both professionally and geographically and around the world. And my observation about people is that they want 2 things primarily. They want to be engaged in whatever work they're doing. They want a challenge. They want to be growing and improving in that work. And the second thing is, we all want human connection. We all want deep, meaningful relationships with people that we care about. And so those are the things that I focus on in my own program, because even though I have 4 kids and a wife and career and all these things, several years ago, I felt like I was on an island. I felt like I was alone, going through my own struggles, being the dad and trying to juggle all these things like we talked about at the beginning. And I didn't feel connected and I didn't feel engaged. In fact, I felt the opposite. I felt disengaged. And so I started working on myself. And in that process, I started this company, Actively Human. And now I help people kind of pay it forward and help them through this difficult time sometimes. Sometimes it's a little existential on paper, externally. If you looked at me several years ago, you go, you have a job, you have a career, you have a paycheck, you're paying the bills, your family's happy and healthy. Like, what's the big deal? What's the problem? And so it can feel a little bit existential, which makes it feel even more alone. But for me, it was this misalignment with, like, okay, now I have these new priorities and I'm not living that way. And so slowly but surely, I started to make those adjustments. And now I help other people do that through Actively Human. I've been doing it for the last 2 years or so, working one-on-one with clients. And I'm happy to launch a group coaching program in March of this year, just 2 months from now. And so any of your listeners that are interested in maybe going a little bit deeper, they can definitely reach out to me on LinkedIn or email. We'll put a bunch of stuff in the show notes, hopefully. But I'd love to reach out to any of your listeners that might be interested in working together.
Yeah, we'll link that up as well. I guess I've got a couple of last questions for you. For guys who are in that spot, who, they feel like they're on an island, is sort of the way that you put it. What are some of the steps that you found are helpful in moving to, a place like where you talked about, where you're feeling connected and thriving, maybe?
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of ways to do it. The first one would be, work on yourself. There's a lot of ways to do that as far as listening to podcasts, reading books. I'm assuming that's kind of the go-to that most people do. I'm going to hit the gym and work on my, physical appearance and my physical health. And those are all great things. That's kind of where I started. You're like grasping at straws and you're just like, what do I do here? But one of the more key things and important things that I've found is that human connection, one of those things that I've observed about people and myself as well, that we need and want, takes work, right? It doesn't just show up at your doorstep. You have to be vulnerable and reach out and connect with other people. And my simple equation for human connection that I teach in my one-on-one coaching and also in my upcoming cohort is really simple. How do we connect with people? There's more than one way to do this, but one simple way to do this is create something of value and share it with other people. Now, my wife, she likes to bake. So she would bake all the time and she'd take cookies or whatever it may be to the neighbor or a friend or something like that. That's her way of creating something and sharing it with people. I told you I wrote a children's book, shared that with my kids, and I learned the lesson that we kind of hoarded that for our family. And that was probably more to do with my limiting beliefs of well, what if nobody wants this or likes this or whatever? And 10 years later, after I wrote it, we gave it out to the public and it's impacted hundreds of people's lives, right? And so I was missing that link of I created something, but I wasn't sharing it with other people. And so I think the result again of that is that when we create something of value, whether it's cookies or a book or a business or whatever it may be, and then we turn around and try to share that with other people, we build that human connection. That's my simple recipe for that right there.
My last question for you, Jake, is in your opinion, what is the definition of modern masculinity?
Yeah, this is a loaded question. I'm sure you've got various answers from different people you've had on the show. I was thinking about this before we jumped on, and there's a lot of ways this can go, but I wanted to share a quote from, I believe it's attributed to Albert Einstein, but he said this, and I think it's very fitting for what is modern masculinity, at least in my view. He said this, he said, try not to become a man of success, but rather try to become a man of value. He is considered successful in our day who gets more out of life than he puts in, but a man of value will give more than he receives. And so the last couple of years, I've tried to live by that. I've tried to definitely work on myself and listen to the different shows and read the books and do all that stuff and kind of build myself up. But I'm trying to give more than I receive now. And that shows up in my family, that shows up in engineering, that shows up in my business. But when we're a little more outside of our own head and look outward a little bit more from a perspective of how can I serve and how can I help? Again, I think it automatically helps our own well-being, but makes great impact on other people. So I would say modern masculinity is much more outward focused and service and loving others.